We're back. Mike's hot. Anna Stavrianakis, welcome to the H Hour studio. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I wouldn't normally do this, but I'm going to do it for this one. Because we're going to be talking about a lot, quite specifically, I think, for most of it, about the international arms trade and subjects around that. You, I would describe, as a person of authority on the subject. Would it be fair to describe you as that, and why? What's your background? What do you do?
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. There are not that many academics and other experts researching the arms trade, so we are a small but select handful, and I would like to count myself amongst them. So I've been doing this for about 20 years. I researched and wrote a PhD at the University of Bristol on the way that non-governmental organisations campaign on arms trade issues. And once I started doing that research and once I started teaching, I realised, actually, I love this. This is what I want to do. And I was lucky enough to get a job straight out of my PhD at the University of Sussex. So I've been at the University of Sussex since September 2006. And about 18 months ago, I decided to go, I went part-time at Sussex so that I could also work part-time with a small little outfit based in London called Shadow World Investigations, which researches corruption with a particular focus on the international arms trade. And that allowed me, well, in the first instance, ironically, it allowed me to do more research because the state of UK higher education is not something I'd wish on anyone. But it also gave me more time to do the stuff that I'd always done in my career, which was doing public and policy engagement. So it gives me time to meet with journalists, parliamentarians, activists, lawyers, campaigners. It gives me time to do stuff like this because I'm not required to be in a classroom on campus. So in the last 18 months, I've done loads more public-facing work and public-facing writing that isn't behind a paywall. So all of academic journal articles are all behind a paywall and people outside of the university system can't access that, and I think that's wrong. So, I mean, how I got into this, completely by accident. I was studying, my first degree was in politics and German. It was only in the final year of my politics degree that we started doing anything that I thought was interesting, which was all the international stuff. So I did a class that it's called Crisis and Conflict. So this will have been, I started uni in 96, so this will have been around 2000. And after that, as I was finishing my degree, I realised we just got onto the interesting stuff. So I went on to do a master's in what's called, at the time, I hope they still run it, was called Critical Security Studies at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth. And then after that, I was working with a conflict prevention NGO called Safer World, which is where I then started to work on UK arms export policy in particular. And I had a brilliant manager who still likes to claim that he taught me everything I know. I was his left-hand woman. And so I was researching and writing briefings and stuff about UK arms export policy. So one of the things to understand about UK arms export policy is that the controls that we have now, such as they are, were really heavily shaped by NGOs. So NGOs were working with Labour when they were in opposition before 1997, saying, so it was after Arms to Iraq, Arms to Iraq and the Scott Report was sort of one of the big scandals of the 1980s. And the NGOs then in the 1990s were working with Labour in opposition, so that when New Labour came into power, Robin Cook and the foreign policy with an ethical dimension, all of that sort of stuff, that was kind of the moment of liberal hope and optimism of the late 1990s. And so the NGOs, were really quite pivotal to laying the policy groundwork for what those controls might look like. And then once Labour came into power, they had the political opportunity to make them into a reality. And so I was working with them in about 2002 or 3. And my recollection of it is that, I'd be writing these briefings. We would do an audit of the government's annual report of its arms exports. And you'd see that even though they had these controls, they were still allowing particular types of military equipment to go to countries that were listed on the Foreign Office's own list of human rights violating countries. And so I'd be there like writing my press release. I'd be like, once again, the government has shown that it doesn't, it's rhetoric, not reality. It doesn't put its money where its mouth is. And then the internal conversation was, well, we can't say it like that.
What's this Blair era now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to welcome the government's annual report and say that, without further assurances, there's the risk that equipment might be misused. I was like, right, but we all think that's bullshit, right? And they were like, yeah, but that's how we have to position it. And so that was the thing that sort of piqued my interest about the difference between what individuals think and what position organisations can take. And so that was how sort of the genesis of my PhD project. And then I was, lucky enough to get a permanent full-time position. I've been at the University of Sussex ever since.
One of the, you touched on this when you were responding to the Platinum subscriber questions to you on the icebreaker. And it was that politicians, leaders of countries and states, and specifically in the UK, and doing things that may be counter to what the general population would like, especially when we come to armed conflict and foreign policy, and involving ourselves in overseas geopolitical events and situations. And on that, I think the way I see the arms trade, as I just see it as I see it as a one slice of the military industrial complex pie, and even the military industrial complex phrase, we were talking about Ben Griffin off air. That is not a phrase I wouldn't probably have even thought of, wouldn't have been on my radar, even when I was interviewing him, five years ago. And now it very firmly is. Would you think it's fair to say that the arms trade is a slice of that pie, the military-industrial complex pie? And the reason I ask it because I think it's an indicator of the motives of the motivations behind why the arms trade functions the way it does.
Yeah. I think the arms trade is the epitome. It exemplifies the military-industrial complex. It's where a bunch of different interests come together in pursuit of profit on the part of the companies and geopolitical or geostrategic interest on the part of the state. And the thing I like so that phrase, the military industrial complex, is still quite popular in like activist and campaigning circles. It's fallen out of favour a bit in academic circles, partly because people keep adding other words to it. So it's like the military industrial entertainment complex, the military industrial entertainment educational complex, because they're like, in the way that war is changing, like you've got to add the entertainment industry, you've got to add films, computer games. So, for example, the accusation that I don't think is accurate, but the accusation that drone pilots are just playing a computer game. And so therefore computer games have got a lot to answer for. People take something that they don't like about how war operates and they add it into that label. So let's bracket that. The thing that I think is useful about the phrase the military industrial complex is that it makes us think about how elite actors work together quite hand in glove. It's not as simple as saying, oh, well, it's all just about arms industry profiteering. Let's be clear, there's quite a lot of arms industry profiteering. But to do that, they have to be enabled by the state. Because the arms industry receives economic support and political support way in excess of any other industry. So BAE Systems only paid, I think in the sort of last round of counting, only paid, I think it was 14% of their own research and development costs.
1-4.
Yeah. The rest was paid by the state. So arms companies are officially private. Some of the UK's biggest arms companies, the state holds what they call a golden share to make sure that the company can't become owned by someone that would go against what the government deems to be the national interest. But officially, the companies are private. And when we think about, like under neoliberalism, we think about private companies in a capitalist economy, we don't think about them being massively subsidized by the state. Arms companies are massively subsidized by the state.
Why is that the case?
I think for two sets of reasons. One is about capitalism and one is about militarism. So the capitalist bit is the economic arguments about the arms industry have been demonstrated time and again to be at the very least contested, if not a myth. So, for example, the arms exports are good for jobs. Well, no, they're not. Not on a national scale. There are pockets, there are places in this country that have become made dependent on arms manufacturing. And I use that phrasing very deliberately. And some of those areas are in parts of the country that are richer and therefore could move away from it quite easily. Other parts, if you live in Brough, or if you
Where's Brough?
Where Northwest, where BAE, and Wharton, where BAE have factories. If you live in parts of Scotland, the best, if not only, manufacturing jobs are in arms manufacturing. Like, I take very seriously the fact that those companies and those jobs are very important economically to those particular towns and regions. But that's a result of deliberate state government choice. Because under Thatcher, we had the running down of other forms of British manufacturing. We had the turn to financialisation, the sort of turn to finance and services as a way for the British economy to grow or not grow. And so the reasons why the arms industry is sort of concentrated in different parts of the country and is differently important to different bits of the economy is a result of political choices. So
it can't be entirely because of that, though. Can't be entirely because of that. It must be partly as well due to geographic location. Could be cheaper. Could be, especially when you talk about arms industry as well. Could be easily security aspects and things like this. Cheaper workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Cheaper or more access to lines of communication, for example.
Yeah. Some of those questions. So the thing about a cheaper workforce, I'd be like, why is the workforce there cheaper? So there's a wonderful feminist scholar. Her name's Cynthia Enloe. She's this awesome, she's tiny. She is well beyond retirement age, but she's still going. And she says, when we ask why things are cheap, we ask, how were they cheapened? So labour isn't just magically cheap in economically depressed parts of the country. Labour is made cheaper because different parts of the country have been treated differently. Like the Northeast, the Northwest, Scotland, they've been economically run down as a matter of state policy. In the 80s.
I don't think that's entirely true. It's not all to do with, I mean, it's not entirely to do with like a de facto state policy which is aimed at running those places down. Surely sometimes it's to do with where those places are, things like accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
You're better off setting up, I don't know, you're better off setting up businesses in close, a lot of businesses, tight businesses in closer proximity to a city than you would be, for example, in the foothills of Snowdonia or pick another mountain range. I mean, I highlight the example. I think places being run down and places being less affluent than other parts of the country, that is also just part and parcel, a result of the way a country is developed. In the same way that there are parts of the world which are poorer than other parts, there are parts of the world which are richer than other parts. It's not necessarily through direct international policies to keep those places run down or bolster other places and get them richer. It's just a matter of the situation. It's victims of circumstance. And I'm not saying it's entirely the case, but I think a lot of the time that is the case. And that's not great if you live in those places and you think, well,
Yeah.
I prefer that isn't to be the
Yeah.
case. But the fact of the matter is, not everyone's born equal and not everyone has the same opportunities as everyone else.
So the question then becomes, what is government doing about those uneven outcomes? Like, does it not matter that some parts of the country are poorer than others and that people have less access to work, education, opportunity than others? And I think the reason why it matters in relation to the arms trade is because, on the one hand, you have these claims that are made about arms manufacturing, about their contribution to the economy, about the number of jobs that they sustain, that are inflated. And they're inflated for political gain because there is the state and the arms industry have an interest in the broader public thinking that the arms industry is good for the economy. But there's also a really pressing set of challenges that the UK and the world faces, the primary one being a climate emergency, that actually, with an active industrial plan to transition away from that, arms workers, as often highly skilled manufacturing workers, could be really well placed to do. We saw during COVID, the government started this thing, the COVID ventilator challenge, and some arms companies were involved in that. And it turns out how it worked out, they didn't end up using those ventilators, partly because of the way that the follow-on bits in terms of where ventilators might be used didn't work out because the government wasn't very organised about it. But what it shows is that when there's an emergency, it turns out you really can make different stuff quite quickly. And that's a question of political will and orientation of economic resources. So if the government was serious about a climate emergency, it could direct its spending to encourage arms companies that currently make weapons to make other things, i.e. renewables, that will help mitigate the climate emergency and also stop the arms industry's contributions to that climate emergency.
Yeah, but what does that tell you about what they think about the climate emergency?
That they don't take it seriously. They want to kick it down the road. Which is sort of how I think about all of this stuff. This is about politics and it's about power.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I don't want to go. The climate emergency piece is different. I don't think that can be comparable to the way the international arms trade is, in terms of the reasons why and what we're doing about it. And I think the key difference is that I think it's fair to say that there's more of a global consensus on where governments are concerned, on how profitable the international arms trade can be, and in the military-industrial complex. We see it most obvious over here in the West because that's the information we're most exposed to. Russia are arguably the same, just on a much smaller scale, because we tend to not allow them to get involved as much as we can, and the same on the China front. But where the climate emergency is concerned, Russia are definitely not aligned, and China are definitely not aligned. I focus on those two obviously because they're the two big other powers right now, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're not taking it seriously. I think we're doing it enough so that people can line their pockets in the short term, but I don't think there's any serious consideration for the long term, because I don't think they believe it's an issue really. I think they're saying it is. I think they're going along with saying it is so they can profiteer off it, but they don't think it is a real issue, and so they're only paying half attention to it. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
But what you've used the term profiteering, and I think that is really important. the arms trade is one of the best vehicles for corruption that there is, because it's really secretive, it involves large sums of money, and projects take a long time. The arms trade is one of the most corrupt trades there is. And that means that people working for the arms companies, but also politicians, but also the brokers, the middlemen, people are creaming off money that is public money. So one of the things to understand about how the arms trade operates is that the costs of military production are paid for by the taxpayer in the form of the defense budget. Arms companies, certainly in most Western states, are privately owned, and increasingly are being owned by investment funds, asset managers. So, for example, BAE Systems is owned to a I can't remember what the figure is, but is owned to a meaningful degree by BlackRock, Vanguard, those like the investment managers funds. So that profit that BAE makes isn't coming back into the national economy, it's going into the pockets of the shareholders. And those shareholders are transnational. They're not even British. So you've got the British public, your and my tax pounds are being used by the state to subsidise military production by private arms companies who are then making the profit privately. And even more than that, it's going into the pockets of shareholders. So that's before we even start talking about corruption.
13%.
There we go.
BlackRock shareholder ownership of BAE. 13%. Yeah, 1-3. Yeah, a lot.
So, and that's before you even start talking about corruption. We know. So, for example, Britain's biggest ever arms deal was the Al Yamamah deal with Saudi Arabia in the 1980s under Thatcher.
Go on. Can you explain that? What was it?
So it's a government-to-government agreement between the UK government and the Saudi government in the early 1980s to provide fighter jets and associated engineering and services support. So the whole package. So it was hardware, but it was also software, and it was personnel in a government-to-government agreement. And the government, the Ministry of Defence, then contracts, then it was British Aerospace, what becomes BAE Systems, to fulfil that government-to-government agreement on its behalf. So British Aerospace, BAE Systems, even though it's formally a private company, is acting directly on behalf of the state because it's contracted to the Ministry of Defence to do this deal with Saudi Arabia. There were allegations at the time that kickbacks, bribes, that money was passing hands to curry favour about exactly which, who the Saudis were going to buy from, what they were going to buy, how many they were going to buy. The UK government always denies being involved in corruption. They might talk about, well, at the time, there were commissions. We paid commissions to middlemen, to brokers, to the people, the intermediaries. They were kickbacks, they were bribes, if you make connections to this person, they'll introduce you to this person. And so the thing about corruption is that it's a two-way relationship. There's got to be a bribe giver, but also someone who's prepared to receive the bribe. One of the things that's really noticeable about the way corruption is talked about, especially in relation to Saudi Arabia, is often that people will say, well, basically, it's their culture. They like the country is run by a corrupt royal family, and well, if we didn't do it, nothing would ever happen, and if we didn't do it, someone else would do it. That ignores the fact that corruption is a two-way relationship. They can't be corrupt if you're not corrupting them. So, but it's really handy to be able to say, well, it's the way they do it over there, which is itself actually a racist formulation, because it's like, oh, well, they're not modern, the Saudis and their tribes,
No, it's not racist. How is it a racist formulation?
because it's formulated in a way that says they are different to us and they are inferior from us. Inferior to us.
Where does the inferior part come in?
Because they are the ones who are corrupt. And it's nothing, we prefer not to do it, but because they go around asking for money, well, we just have to.
Well, I mean, you can argue that an increase, if a country is perceived to be more corrupt than yourselves,
Yeah.
Corruption place, and you could describe it as being inferior in terms of what's the opposite of corruption? Inferior as to how ethically and morally guided it is in terms of its, let's just say it's government, how corrupt the government is. It's not I wouldn't say it's racist. You're just remarking on the attributes of a country or a person.
Who gets called corrupt in international politics?
Everyone.
Isn't it?
Who gets but who do we call corrupt?
Yeah, mostly Middle Eastern and African states.
Yeah. But there's a common denominator there, and not a common denominator. There's a reason for that, and it's not just. Oh, you could say it's mostly African and what other states? Sorry,
Middle Eastern.
African and Middle Eastern states.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are they like in terms of levels of corruption?
I'm talking about the political discourse. I'm talking about who is it that we generally tend to think of in global politics as being corrupt. Generally, I mean, so
it's a fair comment, Anna.
Yes,
I don't see how it's not a fair comment. But the fact that the skin color of those places is darker than ours, that's just a coincidence. Just happens to be the place. You could go and look at countries in Eastern Europe, for example, where skin color's not as dark and it's whiter, closer to what we are, and quite corrupt. And you could say, all right, they're more corrupt than us, or they're worse at hiding it than what our government is, which I think is really the case. All right, they're just not as advanced at doing it. Like,
so who is we? Where does the UK feature in all this? Would you say is the UK corrupt?
I'd say there's definitely parts of the UK government that are corrupt.
So as long as there's like equal opportunities, so we can. If you're happy to say that the UK is also corrupt, like that, I think that. Then it's less about a power imbalance between the UK and another country.
But most people wanted a conversation about racism. This we were talking about racism here, though.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is that saying that Saudi is more corrupt than what we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and saying that a lot of African countries, or most African countries, are more corrupt than what we are.
Yeah.
Is not I wouldn't say that's anything to do with racism. That's to do with an objective observation of what you see.
How did they get like that?
That's an entirely different question.
Well, no, but that's
that's about 2 seconds. That's an entirely different question.
No, I think that's where they meet.
Hang on a second. Entirely different question, right? So how they got there is one question. Let's go back to the point I'm trying to make is describing those countries as corrupt, right? Is nothing to do with racism. It's to do with, like I said, an objective observation of what they are. And you could describe other countries that are, again, nothing to do with skin color. You're just calling countries that are more corrupt than our country more corrupt, or you perceive to be. You're not doing it because they're black or brown or not white. You're doing it because the way they operate is corrupt. Like, there's no racism in there. If it's different, if I was to look at an individual or look at a country, and purely based on the predominant skin color of that country, only on that factor, say corrupt, probably corrupt, which maybe there's some flipping fossils do in parts of the Western world or any part of the country, but I disagree with what you're saying. It's not racism. It's, is it fair to say that most African countries are more corrupt than the UK?
Corruption is a relationship. Right? You've got to have a bribe giver and a bribe taker. Saudi Arabia to a significant degree, became corrupt through its relationship with the US and the UK. Therefore, their corruption is also partly our corruption. The fact that when we talk about them, they are the ones that are corrupt. And when you look at the political discourse, it's still there today. There's a lot of talk about, well, they're a tribal society. They haven't, they're not very modern. There's all this language they're sort of dog whistle words for not like us. And that is a racialized formulation. So the way that corruption is talked about in political and economic circles makes the problem to be internal to them over there and nothing to do with us and our relationship with them. I think an anti-racist position on this, because I think there's some stuff that we're agreeing on, which is that we both think the UK is quite corrupt as well. That, to me, helps us get towards this idea that it's a relationship. Corruption is a relationship between a bribe giver and a bribe taker. Where I think we differ is that you say, well, labeling a country corrupt is just an objective label. I don't think it is objective. I think it's a political outcome, which is why I asked, where did it come from? And you're like, that's a separate question. I think that actually it's not a separate question because we have to look at the history of how countries became like they are.
Well, there's a difference between how a country became what it is and why they do what they do and why you. So let's talk about corruption. How a country became corrupt, right? And what it means to call them corrupt. So can I ask you a question? So what would you describe the behaviors of a country to be to indicate that they are corrupt?
So corruption is the abuse of public funds and political institutions, public institutions for private gain.
Does Saudi Arabia do that?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yes.
You saying that, is that racist?
It's racist if we're talking about the arms trade, corruption in the arms trade. I'm trying to put it into a context.
Go on,
if we don't look at who is making the offer of bribes to them.
No, come on.
You haven't, but you haven't asked me, is the UK corrupt?
The point,
because
sure,
that's
never mind the UK. Sorry.
But it's a relationship.
No, ignore the relationship for 1 second, right? When I make a judgment on someone else or another country, right? I'm doing it based on the actions, right? It's merit, right? I judge people predominantly on what they do. What are you doing? What are you saying? What are you doing? Not about what you look like. Maybe some initial interpersonal interactions, I make a judgment or I assume some things based on physical appearance, from clothing to skin color to the way they present themselves to the way they walk to the gate. The point I wanted to make on the Saudi piece is, okay, you described actions or behaviors that would indicate a country is corrupt. Okay, none of those were to do with skin color. None of those were to do with race. Okay, and those actions you described can be linked to Saudi Arabia, which is why you described them, where Saudi Arabia is concerned. So we described Saudi Arabia as corrupt. Nothing in what you said had anything to do with race. It was all to do with behavior and actions. Mm-hmm. Nothing to do with race whatsoever. We call a race where you're from or on skin color. So it's not a race-related thing. It's entirely on merit. In the same way, calling a country in the Eastern Bloc more corrupt than what we are, I'm making assumptions in the Eastern Bloc, more corrupt than what we are, Bulgaria, for example, more corrupt than what we are, is nothing to do with race whatsoever. So calling it racist is
wait,
by the by.
You've shifted from saying, is a country corrupt, to is it more corrupt than we are? I'm trying to figure out.
If Saudi Arabia calls us corrupt,
yeah,
is that a racist statement?
No.
What's the difference? Because
racism is an operation of power. Racism is a way to differentiate between different groups and to exercise power over them.
So Saudi Arabia calling us. Hang on. Oh, okay, let's choose a different country. Oh, pick a country. Pick a country that's corrupt. Pick one that we haven't influenced. In fact, no. That's unfair. That's
Pick
totally
a country that's
that's
corrupt.
totally unfair.
The
of me.
UK.
That's totally unfair of me. I apologize. It's totally unfair of me. It's totally
I'm trying
unfair of
to-
me.
so I'm
Saudi
trying to- I'm trying to figure
Arabia
out-
calling us corrupt is not
Yeah.
racism, but us calling them corrupt is racist. You see my point?
Yeah, and I want to try and explain why I want to defend that position.
Okay.
And I'm trying to figure out where it is that we're talking at cross purposes. Because I think it matters who is doing the labeling, who is doing the calling of being corrupt. I think you and I sitting here and saying, well, yeah, the UK is pretty corrupt and Saudi's really corrupt, like that's one thing. When you look at what the British government does and who it says is corrupt, the UK government is never going to say that the UK is corrupt, but they're definitely, well, they try not to say that Saudi is corrupt because it really upsets them and then it gets them into trouble, but they sort of dance around it and make excuses for it because the UK state wants to carry on having this relationship with the Saudis that is shot through with bribes and kickbacks because they want to keep them on board for arms sales and that geopolitical relationship and all sorts. I'm coming from a perspective that thinks about British foreign relations and British history through the lens of empire, right? That Britain has historically seen its role as having a right to control what happens in large swathes of the world. Like that was kind of the definition of empire, right? And I find it hard to think about empire without thinking about race and racialization and racism. That part of the dynamic of difference and the power differential between Britain and its colonies was a racialized one. Like look at the debates about like the Windrush generation and immigration. People from the colonies, people from Jamaica, people from India, people from Pakistan who came here in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they were British subjects. They weren't invited, quote unquote, to come to the UK. Britain, until the age of decolonisation, Britain was an empire. And so if you were a brown-skinned person in India before 1947, you were a British subject. But you certainly didn't have the same rights as a white-skinned British subject on mainland Britain. And that dynamic, in 1945, a brown-skinned person in India and a white-skinned person in England were both British subjects, but they had very different rights and access to wealth. And I don't see how you can talk about empire and that power differential between England as the island of England and the colonies without talking about race, because it was one of the ways that power relationship was structured.
Yeah. But to describe Saudi Arabia a corrupt country.
Yeah. Which I would happily do.
Yeah. But you're saying that is a racist. That is racist to do that. When the judgment is made purely on the merits of that country, right? If the UAE describes Saudi as a corrupt country, is that racist?
No, because the power differential between them is different.
The power differential is irrelevant. So when you describe, but it is totally irrelevant. If you're judging Saudi Arabia on the actions of Saudi Arabia, okay, and you make an objective judgment on it, Saudi Arabia is corrupt. You're basing it entirely on the behaviors of Saudi Arabia. That has got nothing to do with racism. It has got everything to do with Saudi Arabia behaving in a corrupt manner. Now, how they do that and why they do that, that is relevant. but it doesn't indicate racism. The reason Saudi Arabia is corrupt is not entirely to do with white nations. It's not entirely to do with Western nations. It's entirely to do with everyone they've interacted with. And if Saudi Arabia wanted to change how corrupt they are, they could do it.
Yeah.
It'd be pretty difficult, but they could do it because arguably a lot of their GDP and a lot of everything their country is based on is linked in with corruption in the same way that we are. But to link in racism to an objective observation of the way something or someone is behaving is incorrect. It's in the same way that in the same way that if a policeman stops a black person because the black person is indicating that they are criminal or looking to conduct criminal intent, people will quite often throw out that's racism, that's discrimination, when most of the time, almost all the time these days, it isn't the case. It's the same thing. Saudi Arabia being corrupt is because of Saudi Arabia being corrupt. Me calling Saudi Arabia corrupt is not because I think Saudi Arabia is inferior because of the color of their skin or the race they are. It's because they're behaving in a corrupt manner. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? I want you to agree, but do you see the point I'm trying to make?
I do.
Okay.
And I'm trying to understand why it's so important for you that this is not talked about in terms of racism.
Because when you try and link racism to any observation about anything, anyone at all, when it isn't relevant, what it does is it dilutes and overshadows the parts of the world and the parts of society where actual racism still actually exists, and it doesn't allow addressing those issues. It sort of underplays it. When you say racism is everywhere,
I'm not saying it's everywhere.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's everywhere.
Okay. When you say racism in places where it's not, or it's linked to things where it's not, it's very easy to excuse the behaviors of other people or other organizations or other countries, right? And organizations, other countries, without just saying, well, they're like that because they're not great, or they're like that because that's just how they behave. That's because they're bad people or a bad country, or you see my point there. It's like you can't just sling it everywhere. It's not everything to do. Just because there are differences in races between two countries doesn't mean any interaction between one to the other in a negative way is racistly inclined. Is racistly a word? Is racistly a word?
It is now. I would agree with that. And yeah, so not however you just put it, like not every negative interaction will necessarily be a result of racism. I think for me, the sticking point, the reason I continue to think that it is relevant is this idea that you seem to want to dismiss, which is that corruption is a two-way relationship.
No, I agree with that.
Therefore, if the way that corruption was talked about by the British elite and the British state and generally was that actually, if they are corrupt, then so are we, then that would not be racist. But at the moment, to only say they are corrupt, whilst pretending that that's nothing to do with us, that's what makes it racist because it's a power play. You might think that
if it's a power, but where's the racism? There's nothing to do with race. We're not saying it because they're Saudis.
Because the countries that we're talking about are primarily those that are racialized as brown or black.
It's not racialized. They are brown or black. It's not racial. They are brown or black. Do you want to get off the topic?
No. Part of me is like, I really want to get off this topic, but part of me thinks it's really important. It's really hard and really important to talk about the centrality of racism to political debate. So when I talk about people who are racialized as brown or black, and you say, no, they are brown or black, I'm going to go back to the example that I gave you when we were off air.
Okay.
Race is only to a limited extent linked to the color of someone's skin. Right? You can't read race. You can't say objectively that someone is brown or black or yellow or white because those categories shift over time, and they've shifted historically and they've shifted politically. so different groups, different nationalities and different groups fall in and out of the category of an ethnic minority or a racial group over time, depending on the time and the circumstances. So race is not objective. Race is a social relation that is about power. We only have race because of racism, right? Why is it that we feel that it's necessary or appropriate to divide the world by skin color? That emerges out of empire and colonialism and was driven by racism. That's how I think about race and racism. So I think we're talking about it in slightly different ways. And the way that you're talking about it is about, firstly, that racism has to be like that it's an interpersonal thing, that like it's about an individual's intention. It can be, and that's like quite deliberate, that a person is actively, deliberately racist towards another person. But racism is also, it's a system, it's a structure that doesn't require an individual's intent to make it happen. The fact that, I'll talk about, the university sector in which I work, the fact that ethnic minority students can come into the university sector with the same or better grades than white students and come out with worse degrees, something is happening. That's when we would start to talk about institutional racism. That the way that people are treated affects how well they are seen to do. So I'm talking in kind of broader, more sociological terms about what race is and how it operates. And the things that I want to insist on are that things about Britain's foreign relations have to be understood in the context of the legacy of empire. And then if we're talking about corruption in particular, you have to talk about it as a relationship between those who are giving if we're talking about bribery in particular, giving the bribe and those receiving a bribe for common gain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Race and visibly and treating people differently based on how they look, skin color, that's eons old and has been the case since we evolved. It's not a new thing. Maybe it was, maybe it was no, not maybe, as time went on, those visual indicators became useful from an oppression standpoint, but they're not new. They're not a product of empire at all, and in fact, they're not just tied to white empire origins, right?
Mm-hmm. So there's always been difference. And there's always been prejudice. The difference between racism and prejudice is that racism has power baked into it. And it's what allows groups to control the life chances of other groups. That's
what do you mean? What do you mean power baked into it?
That the ability to restrict, curtail, selectively empower the access of certain groups to economic and political opportunities is what shapes people's life chances. And that's different from individual prejudice about, like, people are prejudiced about all sorts of things. But it's when it morphs into a social system that quite systematically disadvantages certain groups over others.
I agree with that. Certainly, I totally agree with that. So, and certainly over time, where there are reasons why we have the Equality Act, and there are reasons why we have, from sexual equality to racial equality, we have those things is because let's go to the Empire days. Just looking at the British Empire, you know, we were a white nation. The Empire went and did very well, predominantly in places where it was not white people, for a variety of reasons, not because of the color of the skin of those places, but that is because where we found we could make a lot of money and do well, and we could take advantage of societies which were less what's the word, developed than ourselves, right? You come forward to where we are now, and some of those prejudices and those unnecessary discriminations got carried forward. As you're well aware, you know, treating someone differently purely based on the colour of their skin, which absolutely used to be the case in the UK until relatively recently in history. And the same with treating someone differently purely because of their sex. Absolutely used to be the case until relatively recently. But I think, you know, now we've done as much as we can, I think, to try and through legislation eliminate that. Anyway, coming back onto the international arms trade, we started clashing at 25 minutes in. That was faster than what I thought. It's good though. I know you find it a bit uncomfortable, and people don't know it's uncomfortable for me. They're really difficult topics, and I feel very strongly about them, as you do too. I mean, feel differently. Anyway, so okay, let's come back. How the heck did we get on to that in the first place? We were talking about the relationship between the arms trade, corruption, UK and Saudi. Yeah, is where we were at.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we go from there?
Yeah.
Go again.
Wait, what do you want me to talk about?
I'm trying to remember where we were at.
So I was telling you, we were talking about Al-Yamamah. You'd said profiteering, military-industrial complex. You'd said profiteering.
Yeah.
I said Saudi Arabia, Al-Yamamah.
Yeah. So what was that deal?
It was. So.
Are we friends again?
What?
Are we friends again?
We were always friends, Hugh. Because, as per the icebreaker, I don't break up. Well, I don't know. I mean, were we friends before I walked in here? But I'm not going to break up a friendship just because we have different political view. Anyway, whatever. Let's not go back there. Al-Yamamah. So, Al-Yamamah was the biggest, basically the biggest British arms deal ever for predominantly fighter jets, airplanes. And it was done in the context of the UK as a junior partner to the United States. And it was paid for in oil, and it was absolutely shot through with corruption. There have been follow-on deals. So the latest one, Al-Salam. I mean, the irony is that in Arabic, Al-Yamamah means the dove, symbol of peace, and the Salam deal, Al-Salam, means peace. You know, irony. Was for follow-on orders for fighter jets. And there is a whole contingent of BAE. So BAE Systems is the prime contractor. They're contracted on behalf of the UK Ministry of Defence to fulfil this government-to-government agreement. In Saudi Arabia, there is a whole host of BAE Systems staff and RAF personnel on secondment who are providing the technical engineering logistics support for that fleet of planes and the sort of maintenance and the preparation of them for use in particular in Yemen over the past sort of 9 years. That arms deal, the UK government has always denied that there was any corruption involved. There was a case quite recently, I've forgotten the specific detail of it, but it was basically about two company executives who were taken to court for paying bribes and were found to have paid the bribes, but were not convicted of anything because the court accepted their argument that they were told to do it by the MOD. Therefore, they could not be held responsible for it because it was the MOD that told them to do it. And this was a pretty recent court case. So you've got an institutionalized system of corruption that involves the Ministry of Defence and the arms companies, with a whole network of banks and intermediaries. So banks in the British Virgin Islands, where they can hide it away from scrutiny, that goes into the bank accounts of Saudi members of the Saudi royal family, so Saudi princes, and the various intermediaries that make hay sort of along the way. So apart from the fact that that is siphoning off British taxpayers' money into the pockets of this military industrial complex, this network of actors, like why are my tax pounds going into the pockets of a Saudi prince or into the pockets of an intermediary that BAE are paying? What it also means is that Britain, so Saudi Arabia with the war in Yemen, became increasingly important to the UK as an arms customer, to the point where half of all UK arms exports, this is probably around sort of 2015, 2016, which was when the Saudi-led coalition got involved in the war in Yemen, half of all UK arms exports were going to Saudi Arabia. And so the UK was really dependent on this one relationship. What that means, so now if you're Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have a big defense industrial base of its own, it can't make all its own weapons. It's got this Vision 2030 thing where they say they're going to localize a lot of their production and manufacturing capacity, which is kind of pie in the sky thinking, but also you get British and American companies that are making joint ventures with Saudi companies to support that defense industrial base. Saudi Arabia can't make its own weapons. And that's a common feature of many, call them states of the global south, developing countries. I mean, Saudi Arabia is rich, right? But it doesn't have a strong defense industrial base. So a country like Saudi Arabia, like India, like any of the other big arms importers, are always going to play sellers off against each other. So the classic thing, we see it all the time. Oh, well, we might buy French Rafales instead of your British planes. And because Britain is so dependent, or was so dependent on Saudi, they panic and they take that seriously. But obviously that's what Saudi Arabia is going to do. If you can't make your own weapons, the last thing you want to be is dependent on a single supplier. The irony is that Israel and Saudi Arabia are both dependent on the US and Western Europe. But you do what you can, and I don't say that in an approving way. It's a feature of being in this asymmetrical situation. You play suppliers off against each other. And what you do is you threaten them politically. So, for example, in the UK, there was a serious fraud office investigation into allegations of bribery against BAE Systems for bribery in relation to arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia threatens to cut off intelligence cooperation with the British government and explicitly says, there'll be British blood on British streets if we withdraw our intelligence cooperation. The UK government seemed to just accept that at face value, called off the Serious Fraud Office inquiry. So our own rule of law here was negatively affected by arms sales. And so it's not, and that's completely apart from the fact that the Saudis are taking bribes, they're using arms sales to make patronage networks and to secure the position of the royal family. For the last 9 years, they've been using British supplied weapons in the war in Yemen that until Israel's war on Gaza now was the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. As well as all those things, it also is wasting our taxpayers' money. It's subverting our rule of law. And then there's also the question of what are the British armed forces being armed with if arms exports distort the choices that are being made. So one of the arguments about arms exports is that, in favour of arms exports, is that it's too expensive to have production lines just for UK needs. So you export them as well to make it economically viable. But then you also get a bit of tail wagging the dog, because then we've got to prioritise exports. And then that means that the conversations about what sort of equipment the British military is equipped with gets distorted by that. So there are all of these things. And I'm not saying that I've got all the answers. I'm saying we have to be having this conversation. And at the moment, I think all of these things, people just don't know about it. It's just not, it's not a conversation that we're having, right now there's a lot of talk about we need to increase defense spending. Well, what are we spending that money on? That it's not, and again, I think it goes back to some of the icebreaker questions about how we deal with different opinions. In this, I mean, obviously, I think I'm right, but I don't expect my worldview or my arguments to be simply, oh yeah, well, Anna said, and so therefore we'll do it. But our debate is so, about the arms trade in particular, is so skewed in favor of arms exports, and it's so dominated by government and industry that other voices really, really don't get a look in, and that I think is a problem for a country that wants to say it's a liberal democracy.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. I totally agree with you. I think the main reason, it is the way it is because same with other such industries, which you could say profiteering about, is because that our government and our political infrastructure and system has been completely taken advantage of by capitalism. Basically, we've allowed it to. We haven't. I think that we haven't moved fast enough to identify and implement control measures within government to prevent this from happening. I think it's a natural human desire to want to increase, the resources you have, and these days when you do it too much, it's greed. You go way and above what you need to do, but it's human instinct, and you shouldn't be having that in government. And you mentioned something earlier as well, is that which I've sort of only amazingly I've only recently had realised this. It just baffles me because it's so obvious. Is that things like the international arms trade and the military-industrial complex do exactly what you said earlier. They are, especially the arms trade. You pointed out heavily subsidised, if you want to put it that way, heavily subsidised R&D and things like this. The weapons companies by government. And you pointed out that money comes from taxes. It doesn't come from anywhere else. And that money filters in from our own pockets, literally individuals' pockets, goes into that system. It doesn't come back out. Exactly. It stays within those systems, and it stays within those systems, and it goes to the people who run those systems, run those organizations. It is literally sapping the money from public and putting it into the private or into government completely in a totally corrupt manner. And right now, it infuriates me on almost a daily basis when I see the rhetoric around the Middle East, and I see the rhetoric around Ukraine, and I see the rhetoric around defense spending. You go, and I sort of know where the motivation is behind this. It is because it is predominantly because it is a transfer of money from public to private.
Absolutely.
In reality, when you boil it down, is what it is.
Yeah. And when you look at defense procurement, places like the National Audit Office, who scrutinise government spending and government plans, it's there in black and white. Ministry of Defence procurement, always late, always over budget, never really works properly. And so, if I can ask you something, my sense from the outside is that there's a lot of emphasis in British sort of military posture. There's a lot of emphasis on like high-tech gold-plated kit, expensive big weapons platforms. We've got but then you look at something like the Tempest program, like that's basically unachievable. For you as a soldier, what was your experience? Like there's these two sets of things going on. There's this expensive high-tech kit, but did you always have the kit that you needed as a soldier? We hear these stories that come up occasionally in the news of, soldiers not having, the right, boots, radios, rifles to the type of armoured personnel carrier that they're in. That has this system of profiteering and sucking up taxpayers' money for expensive projects offends me as a civilian because it's taking my tax money. But what was your experience of having access to the kit you needed?
Early on in my career, it was not great. I mean, you will remember some of the horror stories where people have been killed in the early days of the Iraq War and after, because of things like armor
Yeah.
plates not being available to everyone.
Yeah.
And that was my career started off in 2000. I literally started off at the start of the Great War on Terror, the great big profit generator in the sky in the Middle East, and obviously I didn't think that at the time, but just personal experience, like literally personal experience, was there wasn't there weren't enough. So going in for the invasion of Iraq, I went in a pair of black jungle boots, which were fine, by the way, for the climate, but I went in a pair of black jungle boots because there weren't any size 11 desert boots left for me to have at the time. The other people got them, I didn't. There were some, I didn't get any. I went in a what we call a temperate climate, like green tropical DPM green, basically green camouflage for civilians. Green camouflage smock with my desert trousers, desert shirt, because there wasn't enough of my size of desert color smock. Practical examples here. As time went on through that period, which I've referred to many times as the golden age of this century of like soldiering, the sweet spot, if you want to call it that, and the bitter spot, depending on which time you're looking at and which story you're looking at, right? And whether you're still around or not. As time went on, kit improvement got a lot better. Kit was issued much faster because the operational tempo got higher, which means more money gets thrown at it, more money is going to R&D. And from 2003, between 2003 and I say the biggest jump was probably to 2006. For me, the biggest jump I saw, the change in the kit and equipment was huge, and then it was massive again from 2006, which was the first British combat deployment to Afghanistan, Helmand Province, and then from 2006 to 2010-11, that was my last deployment out there in 2010-11. Again, the difference between 06 and 2010-11 was huge again. Like literally everything I was wearing had changed entirely from 4 years before, from what I was wearing to the technological kit I was using. Now, how does that fare up to what the technology and the type of kit that was available at the time to what I was wearing? I don't know. I just know that it was a huge improvement because money was being thrown at it. I think money was being thrown at it. And the way I see it is the beginning of, the noughties are when we realized, the West, UK, USA really realized how much money could be made from drawn out conflicts.
Yeah.
I remember the years when wars were days, weeks, or months long. That's what they were. Years long wars were rare. Now it's de facto. It is years long. That is by engineering. That is deliberate. As I see it, I don't see any other excuse. Look at Ukraine as an example. We know that Ukraine could have been the war could have been brought into diplomatic discussions and conversations could have started very early on and stopped it going on, and we know that didn't happen. That was stopped, and the war's been perpetuated to where we are now. Whatever you think about but people listening, whether you think Russia are right or wrong for being in there, the fact of the matter is, we could have been at a point very early on where fighting has stopped, or stopped for a significant period and allowed for less deaths and more conversation. We, the West, didn't want that to happen, which I think is shocking. Israel Palestine is an entirely different question. Problem. But yeah, I don't know. Would you disagree with anything I'm saying there?
Not really. I think I use a different sort of language to talk about British warfighting, but I think I certainly don't disagree with the idea that there is a state and a corporate interest in prolonged war. So yeah.
What do you mean you use a different language?
So I tend to think of So the question of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, well, maybe it's not a different language, like thinking about the language of counterinsurgency, that actually those wars are always going to be long because I think Western states, well, not just Western states, but powerful states often do a really bad job of understanding actually what it is they're fighting against. And so a counterinsurgency is an asymmetric warfare. And I mean, you'll know all this. You've
Yeah,
fought,
I know,
you
I
fought these
yeah, but
wars. And so it's
treat me like I'm a moron. There's people listening who don't have a clue what you're talking about when you say asymmetric warfare or counterinsurgency.
so you've got, so in a war, so you've got, so in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, like the US war in Vietnam, you're fighting against an enemy that is doesn't have the same like the same military equipment as you. They're not, and they're fighting you in ways that are asymmetric because they don't have the same like manpower, amount of equipment. They're not gonna, it's not gonna be like a two sides fighting direct confrontation against each other. It's gonna be like ambush, guerrilla tactics, that sort of thing, because that's strategically the smart thing for them to do. Because if they stood up to fight in that way, they just get mown down. And that's a common feature of those sorts of campaign. And that's one of the reasons why they get really drawn out. In addition to the fact that I also think that it is politically and economically useful for elites to be in states of continued war. That's the only thing. We're not disagreeing, I would say.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah.
I think the thing that I object to is, or one of the many things I object to, is about the profiteering of the arms industry and also the sort of almost political profiteering of the state by the continual sort of threat of war and the assumption that the way that the British state talks about, well, it's in the national interest or it's about national security. The question I often have is, well, like, who are you talking about here? Whose defense? Whose security? Why is it? I mean, this will be getting a bit off the topic of the arms trade, but why did the UK go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan?
It's totally on topic. No, yeah, go on.
It's not at all obvious to me. It's not at all obvious to me that Britain should have been fighting wars in Iraq or Afghanistan.
No, I agree, and this is one of the reasons. This is one of the reasons why those conflicts last so long. Okay, I'd say that what you're talking about there is a type of warfare in inverted commas, counterinsurgency, asymmetric warfare. That was the only thing available for the opposition, if you want to call it that, to fight against us with if they wished it to. And by the nature of there wasn't a concerted consensus in those countries that we shouldn't have been there, right? Certainly the case in Iraq, certainly the case in Afghanistan until later on. But in reality, I think the main reason that these things dragged on as long as they did, and they did drag on, but again, dragged on intentionally, perpetuated, I say, is because in the case of Iraq, the premise on which we went into that country, invaded that country in 2003, if you remember, was predominantly on, it was almost entirely on, in fact, how we got public consensus on site, was almost entirely on the weapons of mass destruction piece, okay? Which they knew at the time didn't exist. Like, they knew it, we know this now. I know someone who, I said I don't know, I served with someone who went into Iraq pre-invasion with the inspection teams, a military guy who went in with the inspection teams. And I met this guy in a course a few years later after he'd done this. And he said, de facto, they did not go in. It wasn't the case they weren't allowed into the weapons inspection place. They would go, turn up, go to the gate, not go in, come out. There was no inspections done. And he knows for a fact that they came back and said, yeah, there's probably weapons of mass destruction there, So we went in. And sort of the point I'm making is the premise we were in there for was bullshit. And when it's bullshit, so to what end are you going in? What's the end game?
Yeah.
What's the objective? Right,
Yeah.
that's Iraq. And when that is the case, it's much easier to change the goalposts. Where Afghanistan is concerned, that's even worse. That's even worse. You know, went in that first combat tour was 2006, but we were in there since 2001. You know, after 9/11, and the goalposts moved continually. So and those goalposts and those objectives that were given were very much objectives which were not tangible.
Mm.
Were very difficult to measure, if not impossible to measure. So you could never say when it's achieved or not. You can say it, yeah, we've achieved it whenever you wanted, or you could say we haven't achieved it when you wanted. I think it's just the ability to just drag it out, you know. And I mean, it's a tough realization for me to realize that after having done these things and lost friends and other people, you know, I don't know, the countless lives and the civilians, you know, and all the money wasted, you know, and resources wasted. So that's what I think the main reason is. And again, I think I don't know. I mean, is that entirely profit driven? No, I think it's mainly profit driven. Part of it, obviously, where Iraq and Afghanistan is concerned, is geopolitically orientated power and influence on a at a state level. But I I mean, I don't see how you can change it without significant event to change the way we're governed. If I'm being honest, I think that our government's political structure is so poisoned by capitalism, and I believe in capitalism. I don't think it's bad. I think we're allowed to become so poisoned that I don't see a way to get away from it. I don't see how we can't. And to your point, you know, it's we pretend to be you know, one of the foremost, most forward-thinking, most developed countries in the world, and yet we'll quite happily interact with anyone and everyone secretly just to line pockets. In reality, is what we do, playing everyone off against each other just as much as everyone else does. You know, it's
I think, I mean, the one thing that does give me hope is when you look at the mobilization around the general election around independent candidates. And so we've got, you know, was it 4 independent MPs were elected? And I think that what we saw there was the coming together of opposition to the government's response to what Israel was doing in Gaza. So those 4 independent MPs are all elected on a broadly pro-Gaza platform, but also they are all anti-austerity. They're also running on a platform that is about social justice at home as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think that is the seed of something that has the potential to change things in the long term. So in my hometown now of Brighton, but Peter Kyle is my MP, the MP for Hove. He's been very supportive of Israel. There was an independent candidate who ran against him in the election, Tanushka Marar, and there was a really broad-based sort of community engagement program that her campaign ran. They were door knocking. That has carried on. She managed to take like thousands of votes off him. Like she, you know, the goal was to get her deposit back. You know, she well surpassed that. People were voting for her. Peter Kyle has a really secure majority. It was never about unseating Peter Kyle at first go. It was about enabling people to feel like there was someone they could vote for that they actually believed in. And the work that campaign and that group has been doing has carried on after the election. And it's partly about Palestine, but it's also about ownership of the water companies. So Southern Water, they're just pumping shit into the seas. It's about landlords and rents. Brighton is impossibly expensive to live in. I've got colleagues at the university who can't afford to live in Brighton. So, you know, from public utilities to nature to foreign policy on Palestine to the winter fuel allowance, you know, all of these different things that in one sense are all quite different from each other. They're all linked and united by the idea that actually what what unites us is that actually we're all being shafted. We're all being shafted by corporate elites and politicians. And I think people, there is recognition of that. And I think, and that's again, some of the icebreaker questions about, what are the avenues? I think everything is terrible, but there are these tiny little avenues and glimmers of hope. And it's about how we engage with each other and what communities we try and build to then exercise our power to demand what should rightfully be ours. The idea that the water company shouldn't be allowed to pump sewage into the sea. Like, my God, that we have to organise and campaign around that. It should be obvious, but it isn't in the way that Britain is run.
Yeah, again, I think it's a symptom of the complete capture of, not a complete. It's not a symptom of. It's an indicator that government is not serving the people. It's just becoming more and more obvious over the years. Government's not serving the people, and that is not just this government; it's previous governments. Less and less and less inclined to do what the electorate want.
Yeah. I mean, where in my non-university job, where I work at Shadow World Investigations, the work of my colleague Paul Holden, he's South African. He has done a lot of work in South Africa about what is called state capture, which is the capture of the post-apartheid government by business interests. For example, this family called the Gupta brothers, where they've taken public infrastructure and public utilities and basically hollowed them out for private gain. And he's done loads of work with the commission that's been trying to investigate this corruption to the point the corruption is so endemic to the point where the state is captured by private interests. And when I sort of first started working with them, and it was post-COVID, and there'd been all this stuff with the COVID contracts and the VIP fast lane, and who was getting those contracts? And we would sort of joke, not really joking, about, well, actually, maybe state capture is a good term to apply to the UK. That idea is gaining more and more traction when we look at the way that our politics is being, and it's not just being influenced by corporate elites. They are working in tandem. They're in relation to the arms industry. A researcher, Sam Perlow-Freeman at Campaign Against Arms Trade, has said, instead of thinking about the revolving door between industry and government, actually it's an open plan office. Like, I'm sitting there, you're sitting there, like there's a tiny little thin divider between us, but we're basically on the same team. I think that's how you can describe a lot of UK politics at the moment. Look at, education, look at healthcare, look at defence, look at any number of issues. The COVID response was a really good one. That actually you've got the state is not acting in the interests of its entire citizenry.
We're going to pause there. When we come back, I'm going to ask you if you think that is the case at international level as well or not. Back on. Okay, we're back. So my question to be clearer is, do you think there's that level of coordination between international governments who the layman like myself would see and go, oh yeah, they definitely don't talk to each other. They're adversaries. Do you think there's that level of coordination between them and big, like, global leading business people? There's all sorts of conspiracy theories about the men behind the curtain, and I know that I've got a friend who talks and has got his own show on this and discusses this stuff a lot, and he firmly believes that at the top there is major coordination between most of the countries to move society in a way that benefits people who can get rich from it.
Yeah, and I think this right now with the inauguration of Trump as US president, I think it's becoming really, really visible. So within the United States, you've got Elon Musk, world's richest man, now has access to the levers of the state. The Department of Government Efficiency. That you've got state and capital they're one and the same. And he is hollowing out the state. So the thing about people like him is they say they're anti-state and anti-government interference and anti-government regulation. They are, until they can get their hands on it, until they can get their hands on state power, which is exactly what he's done, because he's now situated within the state. So I think within the state, you can see that. And now you can see, Trump his position on the war in Ukraine. Trump and Putin want the same things. They want to be in total control. They want,
sorry.
if they want elite control over the population, that he's got, they're meeting in Saudi Arabia to thrash out a peace plan for Ukraine that doesn't involve Ukraine. Actually, the idea that there is a really big difference between the so-called liberal West and these so-called authoritarian regimes actually is now paper thin. Because actually the way that this sort of cronyism, the corruption, the clientelism, the difference in countries like Russia and China is the sort of political categories of public and private don't work in quite the same way. But in Russia, you had sort of crash privatization after the end of the Cold War, and you get cronies. You get the privatization, but it's still very, very closely tied to politics. In China, they haven't gone through that sort of transition, but it doesn't make a difference whether your country is officially capitalist or not. But either way, what is of interest is a small elite benefiting economically and politically at the expense of everyone else within and across countries.
Yeah, well, I think where Trump and Ukraine is concerned, I mean, his actions there are counter to what would be the case if he purely wanted to make a lot of money of that, perpetuate it like his predecessors all did, and a lot of people in his government right now still want to do. And he's bringing this, and I see it generally in a positive light that he's trying to bring a stop to that. However, does that mean I see it from entirely honest intentions that he's got? No, because he'd be treating Israel Palestine in exactly the same way. Not exactly the same way. He'd be treating Israel and Palestine in a different way to what he is currently. So it does really interest me what's going on with the US at the moment because of Trump's actions, where the military-industrial complex is concerned. Yeah. I'm really surprised that he's been able to do that, and he hasn't been stopped from doing that by the people who have been able to exert so much influence on previous presidents and the administrations. Yeah. Why aren't they able to do it? I don't know. Is he someone that's less easily captured because he knows how to make himself money? He's got better business acumen than the predecessors. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it may surprise you, but where he's concerned, I see him as the best option they could have had out there at the moment. And I think they'd be in a lot worse place if it wasn't him in power. What does that say for the options that the American people had for a president? It doesn't say a lot of great things, Musk. Yeah, I agree exactly with what you're saying. I see Musk as a force for good generally right now. However, if his intentions would change, or the way he's doing things would change, or the way he views the world were to change drastically, even if he thinks it for the right reasons, they could have profound impacts on people, and it could go real badly. For the points you made, that kind of person with that kind of influence and that kind of ties to the business world with governmental influence, can go real wrong. It's great when someone like that is in power and you like them and they do what you think is good until they're not, and then you're screwed. Yeah. We've got a load of questions here I want to come on to, which are in the chat. However, I know that before this interview, you were looking forward to coming on because you haven't chatted to someone with my background before on this. Now, on any of these subjects. So you've already asked me one question. Is there anything else, any other topics you wanted to cover specifically? Not a problem if not. We'll go on to the abundance of questions that are in the chat. But if there are, let's cover them. And
no, I don't think so. I think the main thing was this idea about what those people who are in or were in the military think about the effects of the relationship between the arms industry and the state, the military industrial complex, has on their ability to be soldiers. And relatedly, I think, one of the things that I find really interesting is the way in which veterans often then choose to think about and explore these issues. Like, what was that I was involved in a way that you are, I don't know, not allowed, not able, not encouraged to do while you're serving.
That's it. That is an interest. Okay, so you're not allowed, and in my experience, well, no, I know you're not allowed to discuss these things. It would be totally fine for me to be in the platoon in a unit and be discussing, for example, the morality of whether we should be in a place or the whatever aspect of what we're doing, the whys and wherefores. Discouraged? I wouldn't say we were discouraged either. I was never discouraged from talking about anything like that, but we didn't. It wasn't discussed, so you wouldn't see discouragement, and I think that's down to. Let me think about this. I think that's down to the fact that the age you are when the age I was when we were serving this country, and the age of most, junior ranks when you're going through these things, you are a lot of people. It's your first job. You're there. You're doing something incredibly different with an incredible bunch of people, incredible community. You've built these bonds with people, but regardless of the unit you're in, RAF, Navy, Army, regardless of who you're serving with, where they're from, what the sex is, anything like that. And so I think you're having the time of your life, basically, for most people, whether you're on operations or not. So you don't question it. And part of that is also to do with the mentality that you have to have. So, you're taught to give an orders, you respond to those orders, you complete those orders to the best of your ability, whatever those orders are. Well, whatever those orders are within reason. We are empowered to challenge or not carry out orders which we feel are illegal, basically, or against rules of engagement, which are against the Geneva Convention. We're able to do that. And it has happened in the past, in my own personal experience, orders have not carried out have been given, and because they were wrong, you don't do it. Now, I think because of that mentality, also it dissuades you from questioning the overarching objective. You seem it to be correct. We're going into Iraq. Well, I was told I was going into Iraq. The Iraq War, as far as I was concerned, there were weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq was bad, and Hussein was bad, Saddam Hussein was bad. Amazing, but going in. That's it. Never questioned anything else after. I think the first time I probably went, what's going on in the Iraq War was years later when I met that guy who was on the weapons inspection teams. The same with Afghanistan. We were out 3 times there. It's sort of that mindset. This is what we're doing. This is what I have to do. I've got a job. I've got a job to carry out. The other side to it is from a capability perspective. As a person in command at any level, from a lance corporal in a position like second command, all the way up to colonel, brigadier, general, arguably not that high, because the higher you go, the more involved with politics you become, but much lower down. If you begin to question the morality of what you're doing, for example, and why you're there, then that really impacts your ability to command your men to do what needs to be done. And if your ability to command your men or women is compromised, then the likelihood of something going wrong and one of them not coming back is higher. So you tend not to do it that way either. And maybe for some people, they do have some subconscious questions about it, but they wouldn't bring that to the forefront of their minds. I absolutely questioned nothing in terms of why we were in a place. Zero. And I didn't start questioning it until I started doing this podcast, or a period into after doing this podcast. Now, most people I think who leave won't ever question it. I think really most won't, and I think it's purely because they haven't had the opportunity to, or the need to, think about what they did and what they're part of to any level of depth than they were when they were serving. Conversations like this that I'm having with you now, these challenge the way I think, and I'll change the way I think based on conversations we're having. I'll go back and I'll think about this tonight, and I'll think about probably this one. I'll think of this for a few months. But most people don't have that opportunity or the need to.
Yeah, I to me, that feels like an abdication of the state's responsibility to veterans as citizens or residents of the UK. So when I think about what makes for a life in which someone can flourish, to be able to reflect on the decisions they're about to make, either as a youngster about to join the military or choices they have made and what they've been part of once you leave the military. Like with any change of career, that you would have the opportunity to think about what just happened in your life, but maybe especially in relation to the military because of its special and distinct type of profession that it is, that actually veterans deserve to be empowered to ask questions about why was I sent there? What was I doing?
You can't have that if you can't empower them with that if you know that the reasons people went are disingenuous, right? Now, if you look at, we talked
That's
about
a
Israel
problem.
earlier. Yeah, no, but that's why. You look at the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, right? They probably absolutely can question it because as in within that country, they can question it. An IDF soldier is no longer a soldier and did national service. Will go, was it Wally White that was there? And they can say to themselves, they can believe to themselves, they can ask that question and believe yes, because of the way that country is and everything they are brought up to believe in, where that conflict is concerned and their relationship with the Palestinians, right? Because the entire country is aligned, and it's very difficult. It's very easy to portray a history that that is aligned with the reasons you tell an IDF soldier they've got to do national service, all right? Because that conflict, I really don't want to go down the rabbit hole on that conflict, but because that conflict has been deliberately in later times painted out to be extremely complex, when I think if you go and look at it to any degree and look at the history of it, you go back far enough, you'll see it's pretty simple. But that's why I think over here is not empowered to do that, because the answers would be bad. The answers that a veteran would find for themselves would not be answers they would expect to find, and it would really impact recruitment and retention. I think in reality.
That's the conversation we need to have as a country, I think.
Were the wars we were involved with righteous or not?
Yeah.
I got no issue with that. I don't see it wouldn't ever happen. I don't see what benefit it would bring I don't see what benefit the government would think that would bring. It would just
right. So the government actually is not aligned with what citizens and residents want.
Totally agree.
Yeah, that's
totally
a problem.
Agree. Yeah, totally agree. And it's getting worse and worse and worse.
That's
and
a
worse
problem.
And worse. Yeah, worse and worse and worse. And again, we mentioned earlier, I don't see how to pull ourselves back from that whatsoever, unless we have a major change. And I know you mentioned the 4 independent MPs you mentioned got elected. That's great, but I don't see any impact they'll be able to make, because independents have got absolutely not zero. They've got very little influence or power to get themselves into a position of
at
of
the
influence.
At the moment. So these are simultaneously, these are long political processes. One of the things that I see when I'm teaching, that I think about with activists a lot, that I talk about with friends, is this question of, like, right now, like, what do we do? Like, everything is so terrible. To my mind, I'm of the school of, you can If you do nothing, nothing will ever change. If you do something, still nothing might change, but unless you do something, it definitely won't. So you might as well like die trying. And to that end, I think the upsurge in protest about Palestine, in attention to things like what the water companies are doing, stuff like that, the fact that the government has to change the laws around protest to really clamp down, the way in which the government has used things like Prevent to stop people talking about, shows that they know it's a risk. They see their own citizens and residents as a threat. That is both very bad and shows that there is something to fight for. And so the question that I would open would be, who are the groups available to you, where you live, where you work, all of us, that you can be part of, if nothing else, to start building an alternative form of community that can then start to make demands either in the workplace, either of your local authority or for your MP, that actually we need to be less passive as a population about what our role is politically. The time of just being like, well, they're our MPs, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, we've got to get over that. That actually, you know, it's a naff saying, but people power. If we come together to make, not to ask nicely, but to make demands for our local communities about provision of resources, about provision of education, you know, the stuff that's been, you know, you see mobilizations around school closures, around, you know, there's a conversation in Brighton at the moment about catchment areas and how to try and create equality of opportunity for all school children. It's really hard. It gets really conflictual, and you don't always win. Well, some people win, but you wish you'd won. But that's politics. So I think, you know, I think there are always little seeds of hope, you know, because if there weren't seeds of hope, then we really would be dead yet. We would be dead already politically. You know, we wouldn't be living. But there are seeds of hope where people are coming together to make local campaigns. And in the you know, in the long term, that has the potential, not necessarily, but it has the potential to come to something. And I say this again, you know, in my other job, it comes out of working with two guys who were active in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. You know, one of them, Andrew Feinstein, he worked very closely with Nelson Mandela. You know, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list for ages, but now he's everyone's favorite freedom fighter. You know, the idea that you think change is impossible until the moment it happens. You know, you can look at the experiences of people in Eastern Europe under communism. You can look at, you know, people who've lived under really horribly repressive regimes that are quite different to ours. You know, people are, it doesn't, you know, I'm not, you know, but anyway, but there are different historical experiences of what it is like to live in a really poorly run country. But you've just got to keep organizing. You've got to keep building community. And out of that is where change happens, because actually, you know, it's our money, it's our resources, it's our political power to try and take it back.
When are you saying build community? What do you mean?
I mean, establish connections between people and bonds of reciprocity where people help each other out and where they think about sharing resources, empowering each other, sharing skills in order to be able to pursue some sort of common good, which is never obvious and never taken for granted. It has to be got at through negotiation. That's broadly what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, it's how our society now has evolved, right? Except it went pear-shaped at some point with, again, with all the things we just talked about, capitalism, influencing government, and all of that. And I totally agree with you. You know, we are too complacent these days. We being general population here in the UK specifically, and other places, too complacent. We do a lot of grumbling, we do a lot of moaning, and most people do it at a surface level. They don't think about actually what should be done to change, what they're not happy about. And most people are ignorant to how much change they could bring about if they actually bothered with something.
Yeah.
That could be, from what you're talking about, being more connected with the community and more coordinated in what you want to bring about, what you're not happy with, what you think needs to be changed, and to the other end is, going out and sticking a paper in the ballot box. Both together, we just don't do it enough. And if we are not more active in trying to change things ourselves
Yeah.
than we currently are, things aren't going to change. They're going to get worse, and they've gotten worse over the last 20 odd years for a bunch of reasons. And one of those reasons is because we have become increasingly disconnected from what politics actually is and how we can actually influence it. And MPs are less and less held accountable for not doing what the constituents want,
Yeah, absolutely.
generally speaking. Okay, on to the questions here. That's all right. Okay, from Coke. I think Hugh believes he didn't do anything immoral taking part in deployments to Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and would do them again. What do you think of this and other soldiers who take part in, which to some are immoral wars? I've got thick skin.
So I find it interesting that the question is at the level of individual morality. I have no beef with people who join the military. For me, it's not a question of interpersonal moral judgment. What I would observe is that what you explained was that the nature of serving in the military is such that people, there might be a discussion about the morality of a particular operation, but that it's not the higher up you go, and the fact, the military couldn't work as the military, quote unquote, needs to work if there was really high level questioning of what was happening all the time. So to go, which is what you said. I find it, if we're talking about a citizenry, a population of Britain that is informed, the weapons of mass destruction is a really good idea. We were all sold a dummy, right? To have a population that is informed and able to discuss and to exercise political agency in line with that, to me, that's a political question, a collective political question. It's not a question of individual morality. I will, however, also, I will march for Palestine. I marched against the 2003 Iraq War because I was exercising political agency. For me, in that sense, for a lot of people, the morality framing is one that motivates them and mobilizes them. But for me, it's about collective political action. I think that's where I'd go with it.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, is there any arms trading that the UK does which is morally good?
Is that morally? I mean, what is this Coke?
Yeah.
Again? Right. More like what?
I love the way he said that. It is Coke.
Yo, Coke. Like, what's
the good questions, the challenging questions? He's good for this.
Yeah, but I'm interested in why morality is always the framing, and maybe we're just talking at cross purposes as to what we mean. So
I think when we're talking about good and bad and corruption and things like that.
What was the question? Is there any arms trading?
Are there any arms trading that the UK does which is morally good?
So, I mean, given what's happened to Ukraine, I think it's been right for the UK to send weapons to Ukraine. And actually, the UK and US, once it had got to that point where Russia had invaded Ukraine again in 22, actually they should have sent more and different types of military equipment to enable them to be more front foot forward rather than merely having to defend always against Russian incursions. I think that, and that Ukraine has been a really difficult scenario for arms controllers and for people who broadly see themselves as being on the left and seeing themselves as anti-war. And I've taken a different position to some of those people because I'm of the view that you can't have peace and justice for Ukraine under Russian invasion and occupation. So that would be one example. So I think I think the question of arms trading, what we have at the moment is so bloated, and it's bloated by corporate and state interests, by collusion between state and the industry, by corruption. Introducing the profit motive into arms trading by its very nature makes it ripe for graft and for corruption and all of those things. Equally, if you nationalize the arms industry straight away, because the state has an interest in being a military power, you still have a really big military sector, but taking out the profit motive would definitely help. But you'd also have to then change the nature of what the British state does. I'm extremely sceptical about pretty much all of UK foreign policy. So in that sense, for the most part, I am usually generally sceptical about British arms sales.
The problem is removing the profit aspect of any trade,
Yeah.
including the arms trade, is you drastically reduce innovation, research, development, compared to when you compare it to, let's say we're on a country level, we compare it to a country which is an entirely profit-driven trade, because there's more incentive. There's competition. There's more incentive for the organizations, the companies who do it, who are producing the services and the goods to produce a better thing. So they're the ones that are purchased from. That's the only problem with it. I see a need for it.
So there's not that much competition in the arms industry and the arms trade. And actually, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. Like most of BAE's, which way round is it? I can't remember which way round it is. But like the bulk of military contracts or the bulk of BAE's contracts, they're awarded uncompetitively.
That's because the market evolved to a place where they were allowed to have a monopoly, though, right? BlackRock is a perfect example.
Right. So,
and then they drive the policy of nation states, not the states themselves, because that monopoly has been allowed to exist, been allowed to come to fruition.
So you're saying that under a more properly capitalist, a non-monopoly sort of capitalist system where you would have a greater number of companies actually properly competing with each other. Yeah. I mean, that would be better than this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
If you could. So if you were to introduce some of, when we think about like neoliberal reforms, when we think about reducing state subsidy, increasing competition, all of those, I'm like, they should absolutely do that to the arms industry, because then you'd get rid of a load of the fat off the top. You'd still be left with an arms industry. So I suppose it's a difference between what would be a policy change that would be a step in the right direction versus what you'd like to happen ideally. I think there are absolutely a number of things that you could do to make sort of small incremental steps to make the arms industry less of it's a leech. I mean, it's a bloodsucker. There's plenty of things that you could do to try to stop waste, stop delay, stop corruption. That sort of stuff could absolutely happen, but it's a question of political will.
On that I thought you were going to answer the question before I asked it. There's another. We got 2 questions left to go. Okay. Okay. If the UK government said they'd follow your policy, Anna, what would you advise them?
Stop authorising bribes. Stop subsidising arms production. Stop using the military and the resources of the state to enable arms companies to make profits. There you go, that's 3.
Okay. Last one. What negative impact would the UK experience if we stopped the arms trade with the US and Israel?
What's the first bit? What would the negative consequences be?
What negative impact would it have on the UK if we stopped arms trade with the US and Israel?
So with Israel, I don't think it would have any negative impact at all. I think it's absolutely an urgent political imperative. I think there needs to be a 2-way arms embargo on Israel. 2-way because actually Israeli companies have quite a big presence in the UK, and the UK buys quite a lot of Israeli weaponry. I think for me, it's abundantly clear. Israel is conducting a genocidal war against Palestine, and the UK is complicit, like legally and politically. The US, I think the UK has tried to position itself, this stuff about it's the bridge, it's the transatlantic relationship. We'll never quite throw our lot in totally with Europe because the UK just gets taken for a ride every single time. One of the things I find really sad about the UK is subservience to the US. One of the reasons why the UK has continued to allow parts to go to the F-35 global spare parts pool is because they're scared that the US is going to upset the US and they're going to threaten to cut them out of the F-35 program. Well, they also say that the arms trade brings them leverage. Well, does it or doesn't it? Like, are you going to try it? Are you going to use it or are you not? The UK, especially because of its history as an imperial power, if you think about how the UK could have oriented itself with Commonwealth countries, like the UK could have positioned itself very differently on the world stage, but successive governments have chosen not to. I think the moment now, like seeing what will happen when Starmer goes to meet Trump, like is going to be really telling in terms of how the British state intends to orient itself towards the US. I think in terms of arms sales, it would have to, negative, it depends what you mean by negative consequences, right? It would have to go hand in hand with a much more thorough and radical rethinking of what British military and political strategy is. I think there could and should be serious discussion about how to move the UK away from the US. That is a really big and historical shift that would have to happen, and it's not at all obvious to me what the right answers would be. But I sometimes think about according to the UK's own arms export rules, there are a bunch of reasons and a bunch of stuff that the UK shouldn't be selling to the US. For example, the UK should not be allowing small arms to be exported to the US because the US has a massive, massive gun crime problem. The UK also shouldn't be allowing combat aircraft parts to be going to the US because the US is supporting a genocidal war on the parts of the Israelis. The UK shouldn't have been allowing weapons to go to the US when it invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, but the UK was party to those coalitions. So it's kind of nonsensical. Like, why would you not sell weapons to a state that you're in a coalition with? So the arms sales is just the tip of the iceberg. So in terms of negative consequences, it would be so impossible for the UK to stop selling arms to the US outside of that bigger political shift that I can't even compute it, if you see what I mean. But I think there should absolutely be a conversation about not allowing particular things to go that would be again a step on the way towards that sort of conversation.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I do think we're gonna close it off in a minute, but I do think that one of the benefits of having the current leadership in the US, I'm hoping, will be they'll be enacting less of an interventionist foreign policy. I think compared to what we've seen over the last 20 years. I hope I'm right. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be. I think it's pretty obvious there's going to be no change in what their policy is going to be in regards to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we should be arming Hamas instead?
No.
Asking the question. Part of the problem there is that it's dragged on so long. I don't see. I can see. I totally understand why they resort to violent means there and have done for a long time.
Yeah. So the reason I reacted quite quickly to that, to contextualize it, is when people talk about restricting arms supplies to Israel, like when people talked about restricting arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition and the war in Yemen, one of the knee-jerk reactions you get back, and I'm not saying that you did this, I'm explaining why I reacted like I did, is that the comeback is always, oh right, so you'd rather arm the Houthis, you'd rather arm Hamas, which is a really unhelpful but deliberate act to stymie political discussion. I have had the chair of the parliamentary committees on arms export controls at the time, who was basically a shill for the Emirates and the Saudis, when I was giving evidence to Parliament and I was being critical of UK arms export policy towards Saudi Arabia, he basically implied that I wanted to arm the Houthis, that I was pro-Houthi. Entirely inappropriate and entirely unhelpful politically for a sensible, mature conversation about what UK arms export policy does. So that's the context to some of the way in which that question often gets asked. Separate from that, one of the things, and again, I mean, I feel the need to be careful around this because of the way the government has legislated around how we speak about Hamas. So let me just say that I take seriously the idea that, so Hamas is an armed resistance movement. Like it or not like it, I think it's an accurate description of what Hamas is. In a context of Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid in Palestine. Those are my basic categories for understanding what's happening in Palestine now. The ramifications for what happens in terms of what the UK government's policy ought to be towards that is separate. Well, I certainly don't think it should be arming and diplomatically supporting and doing surveillance flights for Israel. To me, that's just completely wrong. But the question of what you do if you recognise Hamas as an armed resistance movement fighting against settler colonialism and apartheid, I think it is a reasonable answer. I can understand why people would support. The Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. I think that is a bit separate from this always insistence on, but do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? The things get confused and they get conflated. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. And it's very easy to do with that situation out there. I have enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
More challenging than I was expecting, but challenging is a positive thing.
And thank you for modelling disagreement. I mean, I wish you'd sort of let go of the racism bone a bit earlier, but
I can't.
But that was, to me, that this is a model of more people need to be having more conversations like this. That's all I'd say. So thank you.
No, thank you for your time. And how can people follow what you're doing, read what you're doing, and check out the organizations you're involved with?
Thank you. So you can, so if you put my name into Google, there's, and especially if you put arms on the end of it, you'll find both my University of Sussex and my Shadow World Investigations profiles. I'm trying to move away from Twitter because it's owned by Elon Musk onto Blue Sky. So people can find me on Blue Sky if you just put Anna Stavrianakis onto Blue Sky.
Oh, come on.
What?
We need another podcast. But do you not find Blue Sky is a bit of an echo chamber, Anna?
No, it's much less of what compared to Twitter. It's much less of
actually get everything. Actually get everything.
Well, except you don't, because the algorithm only shows you stuff that you're interested in, and we should not start this conversation now.
That. You can change that yourself. Anyway, we won't start that. Okay, Blue Sky.
Yeah. And you can follow Shadow World Investigations on Instagram, on X, on like any of the social media. So Shadow World Investigations is where you can go for much. So my academic work is all through the University of Sussex. All the more kind of political stuff for people to really get their teeth stuck into, follow Shadow World Investigations on any of the social media you can find.
Give your Blue Sky handle again.
I can't remember what it is.
Oh, right.
And it'll be something like Anna Stavrianakis.
Oh, okay, there you go. Okay. Anna. And everything else? No. I'll put the links to all this in the chat as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go get some dinner.
Yeah.